The photograph still haunts me. Black and white, slightly creased at the corners, showing a 7-year-old boy with a gap-toothed smile and a cowlick that refused to stay down no matter how much his mother smoothed it with water. His name was Daniel Ray Mitchell, and on September 14, 1959, he vanished from the face of the earth in a small Washington town called Cedar Hollow. For 63 years, his disappearance remained the darkest secret this community ever kept. And I'm about to tell you something that will change everything you think you know about missing children cases, about small-town loyalty, and about how long a lie can survive when everyone agrees to keep it buried. Because last year, in 2022, they finally made an arrest. And when they announced the name of the suspect, 3 people in Cedar Hollow collapsed. 2 women screamed, and 1 man walked calmly to his car, drove to the bridge at Miller's Creek, and jumped. The person they arrested wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a drifter. It wasn't the obvious suspect everyone had whispered about for decades. It was someone this town had celebrated, protected, and loved for over half a century. Now, before I go any further, I need you to do something for me. If you believe that the truth matters, no matter how long it takes to surface, share this video right now. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see justice served in stories like this. Because Daniel Ray Mitchell was real. His family was real. And the people who watched this video all the way through are the ones who kept his memory alive long enough for the truth to finally emerge. This is a story about time, about memory, and about how a community can become an accomplice to evil without ever realizing what it's done. Cedar Hollow in 1959 was the kind of town that existed in postcards and Norman Rockwell paintings. Population 1,200. 1 main street with a general store, a diner, a barber shop, and a church with a white steeple that you could see from any point in the valley. The mountains rose up on all sides, covered in Douglas fir and western red cedar, creating a natural fortress that kept the outside world exactly where people wanted it, which was far away. Everybody knew everybody. Doors stayed unlocked. Children roamed free from morning until the street lights flickered on. The Mitchell family had been in Cedar Hollow for 4 generations. Daniel's father, Robert Mitchell, worked at the lumber mill on the edge of town, the same mill his father and grandfather had worked before him. His mother, Eleanor, was a seamstress who made wedding dresses and Sunday suits for half the families in the county. They lived in a modest 2-story house on Maple Street, painted yellow with green shutters, and a front porch where Eleanor kept geraniums in ceramic pots. Daniel was their only child, born after 3 miscarriages that had nearly broken Eleanor completely. He came into the world on a January morning during the worst blizzard in 20 years, and the doctor had to ski 3 miles on cross-country skis to reach the house in time for the delivery. From his first breath, Daniel was considered something of a miracle, and perhaps that's what made what happened next feel like punishment from a God who gives only to take away. September 14th started like any other Saturday. Daniel woke early, ate his oatmeal with brown sugar, and asked his mother if he could go to the Harvest Festival at the town square. The festival happened every year in mid-September, celebrating the end of summer and the coming of fall. There were apple bobbing contests, pie-eating competitions, a small carousel that a traveling carnival brought through, and enough cotton candy to rot every tooth in town. Eleanor said yes, but she had conditions. Daniel was to stay with his best friend, Tommy Whitfield. He was to be home before the streetlights came on, and he was absolutely not to go near Miller's Creek, which had been running high after the autumn rains. Daniel promised. He kissed his mother on the cheek. He ran out the door with his favorite red jacket trailing behind him like a cape. He never came home. By 7 o'clock that evening, Eleanor Mitchell was standing on her front porch, watching the streetlights flicker to life one by one down Maple Street. By 8 o'clock, she was walking toward the town square, her heart beating faster with every step. By 9 o'clock, Robert Mitchell had organized a search party of 30 men with flashlights and dogs borrowed from the hunters on the edge of town. They searched through the night. They searched through the next day. They searched through the following week. What they found was almost worse than finding nothing at all. Daniel's red jacket was discovered hanging from a low branch near Miller's Creek, about a quarter mile from the festival grounds. It was placed carefully, deliberately, as if someone had hung it there for the search party to find. Inside the pocket was a single piece of penny candy, the kind sold at the general store, still in its wrapper. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints beyond Daniel's own small shoe prints, which ended abruptly at the creek's edge. No witnesses who had seen anything unusual. It was as if Daniel had walked to the creek, hung up his jacket, and simply dissolved into the rushing water. The official theory, the one that Sheriff Harold Benson put in his report and the one that the newspapers printed, was that Daniel had drowned. The heavy rains had made the creek dangerous. A 7-year-old wouldn't have understood the power of moving water. His body had been carried downstream, perhaps all the way to the Columbia River, where it would never be recovered. Case closed. Tragic accident. The town mourned, and then the town moved on. Except Eleanor Mitchell never believed it. Not for a single day for the rest of her life. I need to tell you about Eleanor, because understanding her is essential to understanding why this case was ever solved at all. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with hands made strong from years of working with needle and thread. Before Daniel's disappearance, people described her as gentle, soft-spoken, the kind of woman who would give you the last of her flour if you needed it for baking. After September 14th, something fundamental changed. The gentleness remained, but beneath it grew a core of steel that nobody had known existed. She kept Daniel's room exactly as he had left it. His bed stayed, made with the same quilt. His toys remained on the shelf. His clothes hung in the closet, even as moths ate holes through the fabric over the years. Robert Mitchell, broken by grief and by his wife's refusal to accept their son's death, began drinking heavily. He stopped going to church. He barely went to work. By 1962, he was spending more time at the tavern on Route 9 than he was spending at home. Eleanor didn't divorce him. In Cedar Hollow in that era, you simply didn't. But she also didn't need him anymore. She needed only one thing, and that was the truth about what had happened to her son. Every Sunday afternoon, Eleanor would walk to Sheriff Benson's office and ask if there were any new developments in Daniel's case. Every Sunday, he would tell her the same thing. There was no case. The boy had drowned. She needed to accept it and find peace. But Eleanor had noticed something that nobody else seemed willing to discuss. She had noticed the way certain people in town had looked at Daniel in the months before he disappeared. She had noticed how one person in particular had shown unusual interest in her son, offering to walk him home from school, bringing him candy at the general store, volunteering to take him fishing at Miller's Creek. That person was Harold Jennings, the assistant pastor at Cedar Hollow Community Church. He was 34 years old in 1959, unmarried, and considered one of the most respected young men in town. He led the youth group every Wednesday evening. He organized the annual Christmas pageant. He visited the sick and the elderly with homemade soup and genuine compassion. Everyone in Cedar Hollow trusted Harold Jennings implicitly, and that was exactly what made Eleanor's suspicions so dangerous. She tried to voice them once, about 3 months after Daniel disappeared. She went to Pastor William Crane, the head of the church, and told him what she had observed. She told him about the fishing trips Harold had taken Daniel on, always just the two of them. She told him about the candy Harold always seemed to have in his pockets for the children. She told him about the way Harold had looked at Daniel during the Harvest Festival, just hours before the boy vanished. Pastor Crane listened with what appeared to be genuine concern. Then he told Eleanor that grief could make the mind see patterns where none existed. He told her that Harold Jennings was like a son to him, that he had known Harold since Harold was a boy himself, and that such accusations could destroy an innocent man's life. He suggested Eleanor speak with Dr. Patterson about her nerves. 3 days later, Robert Mitchell came home from the tavern and told Eleanor that people in town were talking. They were saying she had gone crazy with grief. They were saying she was making wild accusations against a good man. They were saying that if she didn't stop, there would be consequences. Eleanor understood the warning. Cedar Hollow protected its own, and Harold Jennings was one of its own. A grieving mother with no evidence was nothing compared to a respected church leader with the entire community behind him. So Eleanor stopped talking publicly about her suspicions. But she didn't stop watching. She didn't stop documenting. She kept a journal, a simple notebook with a green cloth cover. in which she recorded everything she observed about Harold Jennings for the next 43 years. She noted the children he paid special attention to. She noted the families who suddenly moved away without explanation. She noted the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. She noted the way certain parents kept their children away from Harold while still smiling at him in church. And she noted how Harold's eyes followed the children, always the boys, always the ones who were small for their age, always the ones who were lonely or overlooked. Nobody knew about the journal. Not Robert, who died of liver failure in 1971, still believing his son had drowned in Miller's Creek. Not the new sheriff who replaced Harold Benson in 1968. Not the social workers or the child welfare advocates who began appearing in small towns in the 1980s. Eleanor kept her journal hidden in a false bottom she had sewn into her sewing basket, and she wrote in it every single week until the day she died in 2002, at the age of 87. She died believing that Daniel's killer would never be caught. She died not knowing that her journal would be discovered by her great-niece during the estate sale, and that her great-niece would be a detective with the Washington State Police who specialized in cold cases. Her name was Rebecca Chen, and she was about to become the most hated woman in Cedar Hollow's history. Rebecca Chen was 42 years old when she found Eleanor's journal tucked beneath layers of thread and fabric scraps in that old sewing basket. She had come to Cedar Hollow to help her mother sort through the belongings of a great-aunt she had barely known. Eleanor had been a distant figure in family gatherings, a quiet woman who sat in corners and watched everyone with eyes that seemed to see too much. Rebecca had always assumed she was simply odd, touched by some ancient grief that children weren't meant to understand. Now, reading the journal, Rebecca understood everything. The journal was meticulous. Dates, times, observations, all recorded in Eleanor's small, precise handwriting. But it was more than just surveillance of Harold Jennings. Eleanor had also documented 7 other children in Cedar Hollow and surrounding towns who had gone missing or died under suspicious circumstances between 1959 and 1985. 3 drownings, 2 runaways who were never found, 1 accidental fall from a barn loft, 1 supposed kidnapping by a father during a custody dispute, though the father always denied it and no trace of the child was ever discovered. All boys, all between the ages of 6 and 10, all known to have had contact with Harold Jennings. Rebecca stayed up all night reading. By morning, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her coffee cup. She was a cop. She knew that a 40-year-old journal written by a grieving mother wasn't evidence. She knew that Harold Jennings, now 97 years old and living in the Cedar Hollow Assisted Living Center, would likely die before any case could be built. She knew that the community would close ranks just as it had in 1959. But she also knew something else. She knew that DNA technology had advanced beyond anything Eleanor could have imagined. She knew that ground-penetrating radar could find graves that had been hidden for decades. And she knew that old men, when confronted with their own mortality, sometimes wanted to confess. Let me pause here and ask you something I genuinely want you to think about. If you discovered that a beloved figure in your community, someone who had baptized babies and counseled families and been present at every funeral and wedding for 50 years, was actually a monster, what would you do? Would you speak up, knowing that half the town would turn against you? Would you protect the memory of the dead, even if it meant destroying the living? Or would you do what Cedar Hollow had done for 60 years, which was to look away, to choose comfort over truth, to let sleeping evil lie? Leave your answer in the comments below. I want to know what you would do, because what Rebecca Chen chose to do next required a kind of courage that most people only think they have. Rebecca didn't go to the local authorities first. She had been a cop long enough to know that small-town law enforcement often had deep roots with small-town power structures. Instead, she contacted the FBI's cold case unit and presented Eleanor's journal as the starting point for an investigation. The agent she spoke with was skeptical but intrigued. He ran Harold Jennings's name through their databases and discovered something that made him sit up very straight in his chair. Harold Jennings had applied for a passport in 1986, right around the time that mandatory background checks for people working with children were becoming more common. The application had been denied due to an outstanding warrant in Oregon, a warrant that had somehow been expunged from local records but remained in the federal database. The warrant was for questioning in connection with the disappearance of a 9-year-old boy named Marcus Webb in 1963 in a town called Riverside, about 100 miles south of Cedar Hollow. Marcus Webb's body had never been found. Harold Jennings had been working as a traveling youth minister at the time, moving between small churches throughout the Pacific Northwest. The warrant had been issued, then quietly withdrawn when a local judge determined there was insufficient evidence. The judge's name was William Crane, the same man who had been pastor of Cedar Hollow Community Church, who had retired from the ministry in 1970 to attend law school, and who had become a respected county judge before his death in 1992. The investigation that followed lasted 18 months. Rebecca Chen took a leave of absence from the state police to work with the FBI team, knowing that her involvement would be seen as a conflict of interest but unable to walk away from what Eleanor had started. They began with the oldest cases and worked forward. Ground-penetrating radar was brought to every property Harold Jennings had ever owned or had access to. This included his childhood home on the outskirts of Cedar Hollow, a cabin in the mountains that the church had used for youth retreats, and a small plot of land near Miller's Creek that Harold had purchased in 1961 for reasons he had never explained. The cabin yielded nothing. The childhood home had been demolished and rebuilt in 1978, but the land near Miller's Creek showed anomalies. 3 distinct areas where the ground had been disturbed in a way inconsistent with natural settling or agricultural use. They obtained a warrant and began to dig. What they found beneath the first marker was a rusted metal box containing children's clothing, deteriorated but still identifiable. A red jacket that matched the description of the one Daniel Mitchell had been wearing when he disappeared. A blue shirt that matched the description of what Marcus Webb had worn. A striped sweater that would later be linked to a boy named Peter Sullivan, who had supposedly drowned in Miller's Creek in 1972. The second marker revealed bones. Small bones, consistent with children between the ages of 6 and 12. The forensic anthropologist estimated at least 4 distinct individuals based on the skeletal remains recovered. The third marker revealed Harold Jennings's journal. He had kept his own record, it turned out, not out of remorse, but out of pride. The journal detailed every child in clinical, detached language that made Rebecca physically ill when she read it. He described how he selected them, always looking for the lonely ones, the ones whose parents were distracted or absent, the ones who craved attention and would accept it from any adult who offered kindness. He described his methods, earning trust over months or years, isolating them gradually from family and friends, convincing them that he was their special friend who understood them better than anyone else. He described the final acts without explicit detail, using euphemisms that were nonetheless clear in their meaning. And he described the disposal, always near water, always in places where a child might reasonably have drowned, always leaving behind one item of clothing for searchers to find. Daniel Ray Mitchell was the 4th entry. Entry number 7 was dated 1983. There were 12 entries in total. The journal ended in 1989 when Harold Jennings turned 65 and retired from the ministry due to declining health. Whether he had stopped because his body would no longer allow him to continue, or because some remnant of self-preservation finally kicked in, the investigation could not determine. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning in March of 2022. Harold Jennings was 97 years old, confined to a wheelchair, and suffering from early-stage dementia. The FBI agents who entered the Cedar Hollow Assisted Living Center found him in the recreation room, playing checkers with another resident. He looked up when they called his name, and for just a moment, his eyes cleared. He looked at the agents, then at Rebecca Chen, who had insisted on being present. And he smiled. It was a small smile, barely perceptible, but Rebecca saw it. It was the smile of a man who had gotten away with murder for 63 years and who knew that even now, even with all the evidence, he would likely die before ever seeing the inside of a courtroom. The reaction in Cedar Hollow was immediate and divided. Some residents refused to believe it. Harold Jennings had baptized their children, had performed their wedding ceremonies, had sat with them when their parents died. He couldn't be what the federal agents were saying he was. Others, particularly those who had lived in Cedar Hollow during the years of Harold's ministry, went very quiet. They remembered things they had chosen to forget. Moments that hadn't seemed significant at the time, but now took on horrifying new meaning. And a very few, came forward with their own stories. Stories they had never told anyone. Stories about a youth group trip where something had happened in the cabin. Stories about fishing trips that ended with instructions never to tell anyone what had occurred. Stories about threats delivered with a smile, promises that no one would believe them if they spoke, assurances that their families would be destroyed if they broke their silence. Tommy Whitfield was one of the ones who came forward. He was 70 years old now, a retired schoolteacher who had moved to Seattle decades ago and never returned to Cedar Hollow. He had been Daniel Mitchell's best friend on September 14, 1959, and he had been carrying a secret for 63 years that had shaped every aspect of his life. Tommy had seen what happened. He had been at the Harvest Festival with Daniel, and he had watched as Harold Jennings approached his friend near the cotton candy stand. He had heard Harold offer to take Daniel to see something special near the creek, something that would be their secret. Tommy had wanted to go too, but Harold had said no. This was just for Daniel. Tommy could see it another time. Daniel had looked back at Tommy with excitement on his face, thrilled to be chosen for something special. And Tommy had waved goodbye, never suspecting that he was watching his best friend walk toward his death. When Daniel didn't come home that night, when the search parties formed and the dogs were brought in, Tommy had been too terrified to speak. Harold had found him the next morning, had knelt down to his eye level, and had told him with perfect calm that if Tommy ever told anyone about their conversation at the festival, Tommy's mother would be very, very sorry. Tommy had believed him completely. He had kept silent through the search, through Daniel's memorial service, through the years of watching Eleanor Mitchell walk to the sheriff's office every Sunday afternoon with hope in her eyes. He had kept silent when his own son was born, and he had felt a cold terror when Harold Jennings reached out to shake the baby's hand during the christening ceremony. He had moved away rather than speak. He had let a murderer remain free rather than face the consequences of his silence. The guilt had never left him. It had destroyed his first marriage. It had made him a distant, overprotective father who could never explain to his children why he was the way he was. It had followed him into every classroom where he taught, making him hypervigilant about protecting his students in ways that sometimes seemed irrational to his colleagues. And now, finally, it was driving him to tell the truth. Tommy Whitfield's testimony, combined with the physical evidence and Harold Jennings's own journal, formed the basis of charges in 4 separate murders. Daniel Mitchell, Marcus Webb, Peter Sullivan, and a boy named Christopher Danes who had disappeared in 1978 from a town called Millbrook and whose family had moved away immediately afterward, unable to endure the whispers that their son had probably run away. The other 8 entries in Harold's journal matched unsolved cases across 3 states, and additional charges were expected to follow. The trial was never going to happen the way anyone expected. Harold Jennings's lawyers immediately filed motions arguing that their client was not competent to stand trial due to his dementia. Medical experts examined him and reached conflicting conclusions. The prosecution's psychiatrist believed Harold was faking or exaggerating his cognitive decline, pointing to moments of clarity that suggested calculated manipulation. The defense's psychiatrist insisted that Harold could not meaningfully participate in his own defense and that prosecuting him would be a violation of his constitutional rights. While the legal arguments continued, something unexpected began to happen in Cedar Hollow. People started talking. For the first time in 60 years, the silence that had protected Harold Jennings and everyone who had enabled him began to crack. It started with Margaret Sullivan, Peter's mother, who was 84 years old and living in a nursing home in Spokane. When she heard about the arrest, when she learned that her son had not drowned accidentally, but had been murdered by a man the whole town had trusted, she released a statement through her daughter that was published in newspapers across the state. She wrote about how she had always known, deep in her bones, that something was wrong about Peter's death. She wrote about how Sheriff Benson had dismissed her concerns just as he had dismissed Eleanor Mitchell's. She wrote about how Pastor Crane had counseled her to accept God's will and move forward with faith. And she wrote about how she had spent 50 years wondering if she was insane for believing that her son's death was not an accident. Margaret Sullivan's statement opened the floodgates. Within a week, 14 families had come forward with their own accounts of children who had died or disappeared in the Cedar Hollow area during Harold Jennings's years of ministry. Not all of these cases were connected to Harold. Some were genuine accidents, genuine drownings, genuine runaways who were later found alive. But at least 4 additional cases showed patterns consistent with Harold's methodology, and the investigation expanded accordingly. More importantly, people began talking about what they had known and when they had known it. A retired teacher admitted that she had observed Harold behaving inappropriately with students during a school event in 1967, but had been told by the principal to keep her observations to herself. A former deacon at the church revealed that Pastor Crane had received at least 3 complaints about Harold over the years, all of which had been handled internally through counseling and prayer rather than being reported to authorities. A woman who had been a secretary at the sheriff's department in the 1970s confirmed that Eleanor Mitchell's visits had become something of a joke among the deputies, that they had referred to her as the crazy lady and had placed bets on how long each visit would last. This was the true horror of Cedar Hollow, Rebecca Chen realized. It wasn't just that a monster had lived among them for decades. It was that the entire community had conspired, consciously or unconsciously, to protect him. They had chosen comfort over truth. They had chosen to believe in the goodness of someone they knew rather than accept the evidence of evil that was right in front of them. They had sacrificed children, actual children with actual lives and actual futures, on the altar of their own unwillingness to see what was really happening. The question of accountability became a central issue as the case progressed. Harold Jennings could only be tried for what Harold Jennings had done. But what about everyone who had helped him? What about Pastor Crane, who had suppressed complaints and helped expunge a warrant? He was dead, beyond the reach of earthly justice. What about Sheriff Benson, who had closed cases prematurely and dismissed a grieving mother's accurate suspicions? He was dead too, having passed away in 1981 with a reputation as a fine law enforcement officer who had served his community with distinction. What about Judge Crane, the former pastor who had used his position on the bench to protect his protege from investigation? Dead since 1992. What about Tommy Whitfield, who had seen the beginning of the end and said nothing? He was still alive, but he was also a victim, a child who had been terrorized into silence and had carried that burden for over 60 years. What about the teachers and the deacons and the parents and the neighbors who had noticed things, who had felt uncomfortable, who had perhaps even known or strongly suspected, but who had chosen to look away? Most of them were dead or elderly, their memories fading, their culpability difficult to define legally even if it was clear morally. Rebecca Chen struggled with this question more than any other aspect of the investigation. She had become obsessed with Eleanor Mitchell, with understanding this woman who had fought alone against an entire community for 43 years. She read and reread Eleanor's journal, finding new details each time, marveling at the dedication and the patience and the sheer stubbornness of a mother who refused to abandon her child even decades after his death. And she found herself angry at Eleanor too. Angry that Eleanor had never gone public, never contacted outside authorities, never found a way to make her evidence known beyond her own small notebook hidden in a sewing basket. Why had Eleanor remained silent? Why hadn't she screamed the truth from the rooftops? Consequences be damned. It took Rebecca a long time to understand. Eleanor had tried. She had tried to speak in 1959 and had been silenced. She had tried again in 1963, after Marcus Webb disappeared, approaching the new sheriff with her concerns, only to be threatened with involuntary commitment by Pastor Crane, who had by then become a powerful figure in the county. She had tried a third time in 1974, writing a letter to the state police that had been intercepted by her own husband, who burned it and begged her to stop before she destroyed what was left of their lives. After Robert died, Eleanor had no one left to intercept her attempts. But by then, she was an old woman with a reputation for instability, living alone in a town that had decided long ago that she was not to be believed. Who would have listened? Who would have taken her seriously? The answer, it turned out, was the next generation. Eleanor had known, somehow, that her great-niece would find the journal. In the final entry, dated just 3 days before her death in 2002, Eleanor had written a message that seemed almost prophetic. She wrote about how she knew she would not live to see justice for Daniel. She wrote about how she had failed him as a mother, unable to protect him from the monster in priest's clothing who had stolen him away. But she also wrote about faith, not the faith that Pastor Crane had tried to impose on her, the faith of accepting God's will and moving on, but a different kind of faith. Faith that truth, like water, always finds its way through rock. Faith that what is hidden will eventually be revealed. Faith that someone, someday, would read her words and understand what she had been trying to say for 4 decades. She ended with a simple sentence that Rebecca Chen would later have engraved on Eleanor's headstone. She wrote, "Daniel, I never stopped looking for you." The trial, when it finally happened, was not the dramatic courtroom showdown that movies and television had conditioned the public to expect. Harold Jennings was found competent to stand trial, but his attorneys negotiated a plea agreement that avoided the spectacle of a prolonged legal battle. Harold pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder in exchange for revealing the locations of 4 additional burial sites. He provided this information with the same clinical detachment that characterized his journal, describing the locations as if he were giving directions to a grocery store. The excavations confirmed his account. 4 more families learned what had happened to their children. 4 more names were added to the list of victims that now totaled 12 confirmed deaths. Harold Jennings was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. At 97 years old, with multiple health conditions, he would almost certainly die in prison within a matter of months. Some said this was justice delayed to the point of meaninglessness. Others said that even 1 day behind bars was more than Harold had ever expected to spend. Still others pointed out that the real justice was not in the sentence itself, but in the exposure, in the final, irrevocable destruction of the false image Harold had cultivated for over 6 decades. What happened next in Cedar Hollow was something no one had predicted. The town did not heal in any simple or straightforward way. Some families left, unable to bear the shame of association with a place that would forever be known for its worst resident. Some families stayed and tried to pretend nothing had changed, doubling down on their insistence that Harold must have fooled everyone, that no one could have known, that the community bore no collective responsibility for what had happened. But a surprising number of families chose a different path. They chose accountability. Led by Pastor Michael Torres, who had taken over Cedar Hollow Community Church in 2010 and who had no personal connection to the events of the past, a movement began to form. They called it the Truth and Reconciliation Project, inspired by similar efforts in South Africa and other countries that had faced systematic wrongdoing. The project's first act was to erect a memorial in the town square, near the spot where the Harvest Festival had been held in 1959. The memorial listed the names of all 12 confirmed victims, with space left for additional names if more were identified. It also included a plaque with a statement of acknowledgement that read, "The children named here were failed by our community. We chose comfort over truth. We protected a predator because he was one of us. We silenced those who tried to warn us. We cannot undo what was done, but we can ensure it is never forgotten, and we can commit ourselves to never letting it happen again." The project's second act was more controversial. They invited the families of the victims to return to Cedar Hollow, if they wished, for a ceremony of apology and remembrance. Not all families accepted. Some were too angry, too traumatized, too unwilling to set foot in the town that had harbored their children's killer. But several did come. Among them was Tommy Whitfield, who stood before the assembled community and told the truth about September 14, 1959, for the first time in his life. He described Daniel's excitement about the special secret. He described his own terror when Harold threatened him the next morning. He described 63 years of guilt and silence and the damage it had done to every aspect of his life. And then he apologized, not just to Daniel's memory, but to Eleanor's memory, to the community, and to himself. He said he understood if people hated him for keeping quiet. He said he had hated himself for decades. But he also said that he had finally learned something important about the nature of victimhood and complicity. A child who is threatened into silence by a murderer is a victim, not an accomplice. Tommy had been 7 years old. He had been terrified. He had done what children do when powerful adults tell them to be quiet. The fault lay not with the child, but with the adults who had created the conditions of fear in which that silence could thrive. Tommy's statement prompted others to come forward with their own confessions. Adults who had been children during Harold's ministry shared their stories. Adults who had been Harold's victims shared their stories, some speaking publicly for the first time about abuse they had endured and hidden for decades. And adults who had been bystanders, who had noticed things and said nothing, shared their own guilt and their own journey toward understanding. Rebecca Chen watched all of this with mixed emotions. She had solved the case. She had fulfilled her great aunt's dying wish. She had brought a measure of justice to families who had spent decades not knowing what had happened to their children. But she was not at peace. She could not stop thinking about the children who had been lost between 1959 and 1989, the 30 years during which Harold Jennings had operated freely while Eleanor Mitchell's warnings went unheeded. 12 children, 12 lives. How many of them could have been saved if even one person in authority had listened to Eleanor? If Sheriff Benson had investigated her concerns instead of dismissing them? If Pastor Crane had reported the complaints against Harold instead of handling them internally? If Judge Crane had let that Oregon warrant stand instead of expunging it? If Tommy Whitfield had found the courage to speak despite his terror? If any of the teachers or parents or neighbors who had felt uneasy had acted on their instincts? Rebecca could not answer these questions. No one could, but she could ask them, and she could keep asking them, and she could make sure that others asked them too. Because the lesson of Cedar Hollow was not just about one predator. It was about systems of protection that allowed predators to thrive. It was about the way communities close ranks around their own. It was about the silencing of victims and witnesses. It was about the long-term consequences of choosing comfort over truth. Rebecca resigned from the Washington State Police 6 months after Harold Jennings was sentenced. She had decided to write a book about the case, not a true crime narrative focused on the sensational details of the murders, but a deeper examination of how Cedar Hollow had become complicit in evil. She conducted hundreds of interviews. She reviewed thousands of documents. She traced the social and institutional dynamics that had allowed Harold to operate for 3 decades. And she confronted, with painful honesty, the ways in which her own profession had failed. The FBI had received information about Harold Jennings in the 1980s during a broader investigation into child abuse in religious institutions. The information had been filed and forgotten. The state police had received Eleanor's letter in 1974 and had sent a standard response requesting additional details. When no response came, the matter was dropped. Local law enforcement had repeatedly closed cases that should have remained open, accepted explanations that should have been questioned, and protected a reputation that should have been destroyed. The book was published 2 years after Harold's sentencing. It was titled The Children of Miller's Creek, and it became a national bestseller. More importantly, it became a training text for law enforcement agencies, child protection organizations, and religious institutions across the country. The case of Cedar Hollow was taught in seminars and workshops as an example of how systemic failures enable individual predators. Harold Jennings died in prison 11 months after his sentencing. He never expressed remorse. In his final interview with Rebecca Chen, conducted 2 weeks before his death, he maintained the same calm demeanor he had displayed throughout his ministry. He said he had done what he had done because he could. He said the children had been weak and lonely and had practically asked for his attention. He said the community had been willfully blind because seeing the truth would have cost them too much. And then he said something that haunted Rebecca for years afterward. He said that there were others like him, still operating, still protected, still enabled by communities that preferred comfort to truth. He said Cedar Hollow was not unique. He said the only difference was that Cedar Hollow had gotten caught. Rebecca left that interview shaking. She knew Harold was trying to unsettle her, trying to claim a final victory by making her doubt whether anything she had accomplished actually mattered. But she also knew he was right. Cedar Hollow was not unique. There were other predators in other communities, protected by other systems of silence and denial. The work of exposing them, of creating conditions in which victims and witnesses could speak without fear, of holding institutions accountable for their failures, was not finished. It would never be finished. 10 years after Harold Jennings's arrest, Rebecca Chen stood at the memorial in Cedar Hollow's town square. The list of names had grown. Forensic genealogy had identified 3 additional victims, bringing the confirmed total to 15. The space on the memorial had been expanded accordingly. Rebecca visited every year on September 14th, the anniversary of Daniel Mitchell's disappearance. She had become something of a local celebrity in Cedar Hollow, though she never felt comfortable with the attention. The town had changed dramatically in the decade since the truth came out. Many of the older residents had died or moved away. New families had moved in, drawn by the affordable housing and the natural beauty of the valley, often unaware of the dark history until they saw the memorial and asked questions. Cedar Hollow Community Church had been renamed Cedar Hollow Truth Fellowship. Pastor Torres had retired in 2028 and been replaced by a young woman named Sarah Whitfield. She was Tommy Whitfield's granddaughter, and she had made it her life's mission to create a community of faith that would never again sacrifice children to protect its own reputation. The church had implemented rigorous safeguarding policies. It had opened its records to outside review. It had established a victim support fund and contributed to national efforts to prevent abuse in religious institutions. None of this could bring back the children who had died, but it could honor their memory by creating a future in which such deaths were less likely to occur. On this particular September 14th, Rebecca was not alone at the memorial. Tommy Whitfield was there, as he had been every year since his public confession. He was 80 years old now, his hair completely white, his body bent with age but his eyes clear and present. Beside him stood his son, his daughter-in-law, and his 3 grandchildren. He had told them the truth about his role in Daniel's death when the oldest grandchild turned 7, the same age Tommy had been when he watched his best friend walk away with a killer. He had explained about silence and fear and guilt and the long road to redemption. He had answered their questions honestly, even when the answers were painful. And he had watched as his grandchildren grew up with a different understanding of moral courage than he had possessed at their age. Also present was Maria Webb, the sister of Marcus Webb, who had been 62 years old in 2022 when she learned that her brother had not drowned accidentally in Riverside in 1963. Maria had spent the intervening years building relationships with other victims' families, creating a support network that extended far beyond Cedar Hollow. She organized annual gatherings where families could share their grief and their healing. She advocated for changes in how missing children cases were investigated. She testified before congressional committees about the failures that had allowed predators like Harold Jennings to operate for so long. And standing slightly apart from the group was a woman that Rebecca did not immediately recognize. She was in her 70s, with gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing a black dress and holding a bouquet of yellow flowers. When Rebecca approached her, the woman introduced herself as Linda Patterson, Eleanor Mitchell's neighbor for the last 20 years of Eleanor's life. Linda had a story to tell, one that she had never shared before because she hadn't known it was important. In the final months of Eleanor's life, when her health was failing and her mind occasionally wandered, Eleanor had confided in Linda about her journal. She had told Linda where it was hidden and had asked Linda to ensure it reached the right person someday. Eleanor had specifically mentioned her great-niece, the one who had become a police detective, the one Eleanor believed might have the knowledge and the courage to use the journal effectively. Linda had promised. But after Eleanor's death, when the chaos of the estate sale overwhelmed her, Linda had forgotten about the conversation entirely. It wasn't until she read about the arrest and saw Rebecca's name in the newspapers that she remembered what Eleanor had asked her to do. She had been carrying guilt ever since, wondering if she could have done something sooner, wondering if children could have been saved if she had remembered her promise earlier. Rebecca listened with tears streaming down her face. Then she took Linda's hands and told her something that released a weight the elderly woman had been carrying for 2 decades. She told Linda that it didn't matter when the journal was found. What mattered was that it was found at all. Eleanor had waited 43 years. 3 more years hadn't changed anything essential about the case. The evidence was still there. The truth was still there. Harold Jennings was still punished. And the children were still remembered. That night, after the ceremony at the memorial, after the speeches and the prayers and the laying of flowers, Rebecca Chen sat alone in her hotel room and finished writing the final chapter of her second book. This one was not about Cedar Hollow specifically. It was about the aftermath of evil, about how communities and families and individuals rebuild after discovering that monsters lived among them. She had interviewed hundreds of people over the past decade. Survivors of abuse in churches, schools, sports programs, and families. Witnesses who had spoken and been silenced. Witnesses who had remained silent and later found the courage to speak. Investigators who had succeeded and investigators who had failed. Families of victims who had found justice and families who never would. What she had learned, distilled into the final pages of her book, was this: evil thrives in silence. It thrives when good people convince themselves that what they're seeing cannot be what it appears to be. It thrives when communities prioritize reputation over safety. It thrives when institutions protect their own at the expense of the vulnerable. It thrives when we choose comfort over truth. But evil can be defeated. Not easily, not quickly, not without cost. But it can be defeated when even one person refuses to be silent. Eleanor Mitchell was that person. For 43 years, she was the only one who kept the flame of truth burning in Cedar Hollow. She died believing she had failed. She died not knowing that her journal would be found, that her great-niece would dedicate years to building the case she could never build herself, that Harold Jennings would die in prison, that Cedar Hollow would transform itself into a model of accountability and prevention. Eleanor Mitchell did not fail. She succeeded beyond anything she could have imagined. Her victory was not the dramatic courtroom triumph that movies promise. It was slower, quieter, earned across decades rather than days. But it was real. Daniel Ray Mitchell was found. His body was recovered and buried next to his mother in the Cedar Hollow Cemetery. His name was spoken aloud by people who had never met him but who cared enough to remember. His death was not meaningless. It became the catalyst for changes that would protect children for generations to come. Rebecca Chen finished her book at 3 in the morning. She saved the file, closed her laptop, and walked to the window of her hotel room. Outside, the first hints of dawn were appearing over the mountains that surrounded Cedar Hollow. The Douglas firs and western red cedars stood silent and ancient, witnesses to everything that had happened in this valley over the past century. In a few hours, Rebecca would drive back to Seattle. She would publish her book. She would continue her advocacy work. She would speak at conferences and train investigators and meet with families of missing children. But right now, in this quiet moment before dawn, she allowed herself to feel something she rarely felt. Peace. Not complete peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of knowing that she had done what Eleanor had asked. She had told the truth. She had not stopped looking. And against all odds, against a community that had protected evil for 60 years, against a system designed to enable silence, against the simple passage of time that buries so many crimes beyond recovery, truth had won. Daniel Ray Mitchell, the 7-year-old boy with the gap-toothed smile and the cowlick that would not stay down, was home. His mother was with him. And the town that had failed them both had finally, belatedly, incompletely, but genuinely, chosen to become something better. The sun rose over the mountains. The first birds began to sing. And in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Cedar Hollow, beside a headstone that read, "Daniel, I never stopped looking for you," the ghost of a mother's love kept watch over her son, as it always had, as it always would, as it was finally at peace.